Hello. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm very pleased to be here to open the 7th annual Doran Lecture. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very pleased that Alan Doran could make it and join us this year again, as he has in every lecture, and now it's a commitment that he will be here for every single lecture. But we have a very exciting lecture. We're very pleased to have Dr. Bhaskar Vira come and join us and give us a fascinating lecture on a topic that we have not yet heard. I want first, though, to invite the Dean, Dr. Veera Vinitsky-Seroussi, to come say a few words, and then Alan Doran will come and also speak briefly. Thank you.
First of all, I need to apologize because I have to leave right after your comments, and I'm sure I'm going to miss a wonderful talk. I'm truly honored to welcome all of you on behalf of the Faculty of Social Sciences to the annual Doran Lecture. While part of being a dean is being invited to welcome guests of the university, distinguished professors, and many others, I see this evening as a special opportunity for me not just to welcome our distinguished lecturer, which I will be happily do in a minute, but to thank Mr. Alan Doran from the bottom of my heart for being such a dear and important friend and partner of the faculty in general and of our Glocal program in particular. I think that by pushing Israeli academia in the direction of being more exposed to the importance of population and resources in the world, you have done us a favor, a big favor. So thank you for that. But in addition, being such a dear and important friend to Glocal, you managed to help us merge two issues that this faculty is about: academic excellence and social caring. Now, as we all know, dreams need friends to be fulfilled, and you are, for a long time by now, is a true friend. I will leave Professor Guy Steklov to introduce Professor Veera and his fascinating research, but let me just say that I find the title as extremely interesting in Israeli context. Boundaries, or lack of them thereof, is one of the characters, if not an organizing principle of this society. One can look at the obvious macro level, where the state of Israel, for various and different reasons, has no clear and agreed boundaries. But also on the micro level, people hardly maintain physical space from each other. Distance apparently is not for us. For better or for worse, both at the macro and at the micro level, this place and this culture lacks boundaries. So I'm sure we can learn a lot about boundaries, about thresholds, and about limits. So thank you, Mr. Doran, for being our partner, and thank you, Professor Veera, for sharing your thoughts with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here again for the 7th time. Veera's remarks are very kind, slightly over the top, but thank you very much. It's very good to hear. I hope my head stays the right size. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased that finally we've got somebody from my old alma mater, Latin, Cambridge. I was there a few years ago. And the other thing I wanted to mention was that I think Dr. Veera shares something else in that he is clearly a multidisciplinary person with a broad range of ideas. I know that there'll be a more formal introduction in a minute, but that's something I did notice. And for my pains, I have a similar experience. I did engineering at Cambridge, and then I did history and philosophy of science, and then I did accountancy, and then I did a master's in development economics, and now I work for Oxfam in promoting economic development. Some of you will come to my seminar next week when I will elaborate more. And the funny thing is that I inherited the diversity from my father, in whose name these lectures are given. And he was a very remarkable character who was a refugee in England, penniless pretty well, left school at 14, and acquired a huge range of qualifications, basically financing himself. He lived on herrings and porridge, which were the two cheapest foods in the late 20s and 30s of the last century. He was also extremely exercised by population, but rather along the lines of the Ehrlichs, the population bomb. He had a fairly narrow vision about too many people. But I sold him the idea of this annual lecture series on the basis that population would figure, not in the way that perhaps he thought it would, but anyway, that's the way it was. So I won't say any more, but I'm delighted to see you all, and I'm very pleased that the Glocal students are here, which is a great thing. I think that's a great advance that we've integrated the two things more this year. So, thanks.
Well, again, thank you very much. And I am going to be brief, but I do want to take this opportunity to say a few words about Dr. Bhaskar Vira, who is our lecturer. Dr. Bhaskar Vira, senior lecturer at the University of Cambridge in England. He's also the director of the Cambridge Conservation Research Institute. We bring him today for many reasons, other than he's an excellent scholar, but he's also bringing to our series a very, very different perspective than we've had before. He's trained as an economist, which shows that you can do amazing things despite being trained as an economist. I don't think there are any economists here. But he does some fascinating... No, I'm just envious. But he does fascinating work, political economic work, looking at sustainability. He does some of this work looking at ecosystems, even within the UK. He does a lot of his work and advises a lot of students that work in India and more local areas. He has a fascinating breadth, as Alan alluded to, and it's very exciting to read his work, and we're very excited to get this lecture, which takes us in a very different direction than past lectures. So thank you very much, and I'm going to pass on the mic without walking away with it. Here we go. I also want to thank Shira, the one and only, for doing an amazing job in helping us organize this. Thank you.
Guy, thank you for those very warm words of welcome. I am absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you to the faculty for inviting me to do this lecture. And Alan, thank you very much for giving the opportunity for scholars to interact with each other and to have this wonderful opportunity to share ideas. It's a great idea. I'm so pleased to be in this distinguished line of lecturers who've delivered these lectures. And I look forward to the conversation as we go forward. I'm also delighted that the Glocal students are here. It's a really innovative program, which I've been delighted to read about. It's very interesting to see that combination of real commitment to scholarship and practice coming together in a program. It shares a little bit with what we're trying to do. We have a similar sort of idea lying behind a master's that we've just introduced. And interestingly, we are also in our 4th cohort of students. So these ideas seem to find their own currency in the world. So I look forward to interacting with you and talking to you about your experiences. It's a wonderful opportunity, and of course it's a great opportunity to renew my long friendship with Avner, who we've known each other for a long time. We haven't met in many, many years, and it's wonderful to be here. So thank you for that. I did think about the title of my talk and about how specifically these issues resonate with the context in which I'm delivering it. But I also thought it would be an opportunity to explore the kinds of ideas that Alan's father might have encountered in the context of thinking about population, and then trying to broaden these ideas around thresholds, boundaries, limits, which have been around with us for a very long time in a world of political economy. And it's interesting to remember that Malthus was a political economist, if you want to claim him in one particular part of the world, and had an association with the university I happen to be associated with at the moment. So there are these sort of overlapping things that have brought together the subject of my talk. Numbers are a very important part of the population discussion. And last year, 2 books used 10 billion as the number which would animate their cover. And I thought that would be a sort of interesting point to start with. And to start with this question of demography and destiny, which is associated with the French philosopher Comte, although people can't actually find the quote. So people often suggest that Comte said demography is destiny. But if you look for the source, it's very difficult to locate. So I'm just asking the rhetorical question, is demography destiny? Are we sort of projected into a future very much driven by the numbers? And does 10 billion evoke the kind of challenge that people might be associating with it? Interestingly, the people who wrote those books with the cover 10 billion were not coming at it from the same position. And I think one of the issues that will arise in the context of my lecture, in the context of our discussion, is that the way in which people look at population varies a lot. And we can talk about the sort of classic divide between the optimists and the pessimists. We can talk about the pessimists adopting various degrees of anger. And 10 billion, the book by Stephen Emmett, is a very angry book. There are versions of it available, including in The Observer and The Guardian newspaper, in which he makes a really passionate plea for a dramatic shift, because we simply aren't taking these issues seriously enough. Danny Dorling, the geographer, writes about 10 billion in a slightly more optimistic vein. He calls himself a practical possibilist. He thinks that there are possibilities, that these are ones which can be worked through if human society would be willing to work their way through. And of course, the picture in the middle is Hans Rosling, whom some of you might have encountered with his very interesting presentation of data through Gapminder, and a series of lectures which he does, in which he talks about his perspectives on, most recently on population, where he again finds reasons to be optimistic. He thinks that some of the concerns might be slightly overblown. So he's got this really interesting 1-hour video called Don't Panic, which is on downloadable, and he's advising us not to panic about the challenges of 10 billion. So as ever, from Malthusian times, these debates remain. People remain, on the one hand, very concerned about the challenges of 9, 10 billion people. On the other hand, others suggest that we shouldn't be overly concerned, but we do need to take it seriously. Remaining with the UK context for a minute, Jonathan Porritt is one of the founders of Friends of the Earth. And last year, again, so 2013 seemed to be a sort of important year in this debate, started this campaign asking the UK's environment organizations like the one that he founded, Friends of the Earth, but WWF and a whole range of organizations, what their positions were on population. And he was asking them a very specific question. What are you doing in terms of your campaigning and your research in terms of taking the issue of population seriously? And he then produced this report based on his campaign on population. And he was very disappointed with the response that he got. And just a very, that quote basically summarizes what Porritt finds, that for most of these big NGOs, the issue of population per se has fallen off the radar. They're not concerning themselves about the population issue. He says that it's grudgingly acknowledged as an important area of concern, but as environmental organizations, they feel that they don't want to actively get involved in talking about population. And we need to think about that. Why is that happening? Why are environmental organizations treating that as something that is difficult to touch? What is it about the issue that makes it politically sensitive, possibly? Why do people not want to talk about it? Porritt, of course, is very angry about this and would like us to take it more seriously, would like environmental NGOs to take it more seriously. One more context-setting slide, and then I'll talk about the sort of issues of boundaries and thresholds which animate some of my lecture. This is the UN population projections. I've picked them out from a 2011 paper. I suppose one of the things to look at is that hockey stick, as it's been called the hockey stick for all sorts of other reasons. The climate figure, which looks very much like that, the numbers might be slightly different. But essentially this explosion which takes place during the period of the post-industrial revolution, the sort of 19th century onwards, Estimates suggest that going from the 7 billion that we were in 2011 to the 8 billion that we might be by 2024 is going to be accelerated. It's just 13 years to add another billion people to the world. And of course, the 10 billion figure that we saw on the covers of those books is based on projections looking further ahead. So that's the context, the sort of the concerns are being expressed through this sort of evidence, which suggests that the population explosion is with us. We're very much living with it. So let me turn to the ways in which this has been thought about in the fields of ecology, in the fields of environmental science. And one way of capturing this, which has become quite fashionable and has been used a lot as a way of expressing a well-known idea that we might be running out of space, is through this notion of planetary boundaries. And this is work which has come out of Stockholm from the Resilience Center in Stockholm, led by Johan Rockström and his team. And they talk about planetary boundaries across 9 different dimensions. And they think about this in the context of, is humanity at risk of pushing the planet beyond its ability to sustain human life? Are there certain biophysical subsystems that are now no longer viable? And the data which they've gathered suggests that at least in 3 areas, we are no longer within what he would call a safe operating space for humanity, that we've pushed ourselves across in these boundaries. And you don't need to necessarily get into the detail, and I don't think the detail is so important for the context of my lecture. There have been discussions about whether these boundaries truly exist, whether the data supports it, but it's a heuristic device. It's an analytical way of expressing the idea that has been around with us for a very long time, that we are potentially pushing the planet's biophysical systems beyond their ability to sustain life on Earth. The idea of the threshold is very closely related, and work which colleagues associated with Rockström and Rockström himself have published in Trends in Ecology and the Environment recently in 2013, that's where this lower diagram is borrowed from, talks about the threshold. And really, again, what you're looking at are the differences between these 3 different ecological processes. You have your drivers of change down here. And what they're saying is that ecological processes don't always follow this smooth path to degradation. Things don't happen gradually. And the idea of the threshold is when your ecological process might display this kind of behavior, a sudden cliff, or indeed might display what they call hysterical behavior, which kind of goes into a much more disturbed state. And when you're standing up here, you don't know which of those 3 patterns you're going to observe in the next few years. And their warning is that these threshold effects could be catastrophic. We might push ourselves off that precipice, push ourselves off this very sharp cliff. And that's why the threshold notion is also a very interesting one to think about. That we may be close to a boundary, but if we don't know whether the system is going to behave gradually or whether it's going to display these threshold effects, we could have very different management implications. The gradualism might allow us a little bit more time. The threshold tells us that we have very little time. And we need to understand the ecology of these processes very carefully. So that's where sort of the boundaries and thresholds idea comes from. We have to relate it to a much longer tradition of thinking in this. And of course, Alan's already mentioned the Ehrlichs. There they are, pictured in 2013. Very interesting paper of theirs in the Royal Society Proceedings, which had this picture of them sitting with a panda between them. So I thought I'll reproduce the picture from the paper as well as the conclusions of their paper. But of course, it goes back to much earlier thinking, the limits to growth, which is a well-known term and phrase, the Club of Rome report, which came out in the early 1970s, soon after the Ehrlichs had published their population bomb. So clearly, this kind of thinking in the ecological world has been around for a while. One of the things I'd like to sort of highlight about Ehrlich's way of thinking, which I think I would say I very strongly still agree with, was his simple identity of how humanity has an impact on natural systems, which he said could be broken down broadly into 3 components. One is demographic, how many people we are, population, the P in that equation, Pi equals PAT. The second he called affluence, which worked for using the IPAT equation. It's a shorthand for consumption, the way in which we consume, and those consumption patterns determine our impact. and technology as our third mediating factor. And what he said is that really, if you think about humanity's impact, it can be broken down into some combination of population impacts, consumption impacts, mediated by the way in which technology allows us potentially to reduce some of those impacts because we can consume more efficiently. So that as an identity, as a way of thinking about the way in which humanity has an impact, I think is still an interesting way to break down these different components and to start to have that debate about, should environmental groups be talking about population, should they be talking about consumption, should they be talking about technology, or should they be talking about all three, which is what Jonathan Porritt would like us to start to have that debate about. Why are they neglecting the P in the IPAT is an interesting question. I wanted to see what the Ehrlichs thought in 2013, so I thought I'd read their paper and see what we could extract from it. And there's a really that last bit is a quote from their paper. Do we think global society can avoid a collapse in this century? And they say in their conclusions, the answer is yes, we can avoid a collapse. Because modern society has shown some capacity to deal with long-term threats. That seems quite surprisingly positive, at least if they are obvious or continuously brought to attention. And this is the qualifier. What they're saying is that we continue to be at risk because we are failing to pay attention to some of these major threats, that these issues we have the capacity to deal with if we care about them. But if we fail to take account of them, then society is threatened with global collapse. So they have a nuanced position. It's less extreme than the late 1960s. I'm sure it comes with age. But that's something which is really interesting to see. And what they then end up saying is that we need dramatic cultural change. So if they have pessimism today in their paper, it's about their pessimism about whether society is ready for this dramatic cultural change that's needed in order to avoid global collapse. They accept that if we took it seriously enough, the evidence of the last 40 years suggests that we've been able to cope with some pretty serious issues. So society does have the resources, the ingenuity, if it cares enough about these issues. And their challenge to us is take these issues seriously enough to do something about it. So that's the way in which some of this limits literature as well. I thought I'd also introduce this other idea, the ecological footprint, which some of you might have encountered. Now that's a really interesting, again, device to talk about how fast we consume resources and how quickly natural systems can either produce those resources or absorb the waste that we produce. So the ecological footprint is a way of capturing that. It's looking at the ratio of our consumption patterns and the ability of natural systems to regenerate themselves in relation to our consumption pattern. And they've started to create this thing called Earth Overshoot Day. There's a day in the year when humanity runs out of the resources that it's been able to create, that our consumption patterns have then exceeded the ability of the Earth to regenerate over a 12-month period. Now that date in 1993 was October the 21st, about a year or so before Avna and I first met. In 2013, that date had come forward to August the 20th. So you see what's going on here, that we're running out of the natural system's ability to regenerate quicker and quicker. Something like 8 months into the year, we've run out of 12 months worth of regenerative capacity. And that's an interesting, again, way of capturing this notion of limits, this ecological footprint. Another way in which they've expressed this is how many Chinas does it take to support China? The answer to that is 2.5. If you look at some of the other countries, it takes 1.8 Indias to support India. It takes 7.1 Japans to support Japan, and so on. You can see a number of those countries represented there. And you can actually do this ecological footprint calculator even down to the personal level. So if you go onto the website, which is there, you can actually talk about your personal ecological footprint. And I stand severely guilty in this regard because I have just flown many, many thousand miles to spend 2 days with you, and I don't think that's a very sustainable way for us to live. But equally, if we don't meet, how do we sustain the human conversation that is going to create the responses that we need? So I'm deeply conflicted about this travel issue. How do we deal with this in a way, recognizing this ecological footprint? Whose resources have I borrowed in order to be with you today? How am I able to repay that in terms of my ecological debt to other people. So let's think about that when we get a chance to talk in a little bit more detail. Just concluding that footprint idea, this is just a sort of trajectory of global ecological footprints, taking it into the future. So this is now going back to the planetary scale. So their estimates suggest that at the moment we need about 1.5 Earths to sustain life on Earth. So we're consuming about 50% more than we produce within the natural ecosystems that currently sustain us. And then they've done some scenarios looking forward to 2050, which is the kind of thing demographers love doing as well. What's going to happen in the future? And let's try and think about what those futures might mean for us. And they have this graph which sort of says there are two possibilities. If we carry on a moderate business as usual path, we're going to eventually need something like 3 times the number of Earths we currently have to sustain our consumption patterns. But they also talk about this other trajectory, which is a rapid reduction trajectory. And what they're saying is that, much like what the Ehrlichs are saying, we need dramatic cultural change. We need a dramatic change in these patterns in order to sustain ourselves within the planetary boundary, which is defined by the single Earth. So if we want to stay within the single Earth, we need to create this kind of turning point in our patterns of consumption. Let's go back to the demographers and see what they're saying about this. So the population projections, this is the revised population projections from the same source that I had the previous figure, also look like they have different scenarios. And very quickly, to cut through what the differences in those graphs are, what the future of the global population will look like is very dependent on the assumptions that you make in terms of what happens to total fertility rates. If you assume constant fertility rates, the population really takes off and goes over 25 billion. If you believe that fertility rates will start leveling off, which is a sort of medium scenario, that's where you get your 10 billion figure from. That's what the covers of those books are basing it on. But if actually fertility rates in a number of countries start to go down to 1.6, as evidence suggests that in some places has happened, you might actually get a much lower leveling off of the global population, well below the 10 billion of those covers. So what divides those different projections is really assumptions around fertility rates. Evidence on what's going to happen is limited, because what global demographers have been doing is that they look at replacement fertility, which is slightly over 2. And what happens beyond that, below 2, is something which is actually a sort of under-researched area. What happens in the countries of Europe, which are experiencing declining fertility, declining well below replacement levels? And interestingly, in countries like India, in the southern states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, where you start to get below replacement fertility, you're going below 2. And that's the uncharted territory. But that's critically important in terms of these projections. So I'm not a demographer. I dabble as, by reading a little bit. But what seems to be really exercising the demographers at the moment is these questions around what is going to happen to global fertility in the 21st century. So coming back to the fertility trends, again, this is what the UN's population division reported in 2011 when it did its revisions. And this is the interesting figure down here. So the yellow ones are the more developed countries who are experiencing well below 2 in terms of their fertility. Now the question really is, where is the rest of the world going to level off? If the rest of the world levels off well below 2, then some of the less catastrophic population futures are the ones that are likely to prevail. If the rest of the world levels off at something like 2, we might be at a 10 billion number. And those are issues that are still being debated. But that's really where the sort of fertility discussion currently rests. So in this context, the UK's Royal Society brought together a group of leading experts and produced this report, which is a working group of the Royal Society on people and the planet. That's what they called it. And it was looking at issues around population. It was animated by this new revision to the UN population figures. And again, most of these sources should be easily available, and I'm going to leave my PowerPoint behind. So if you need to follow some of these references, they will be available for you to look at. I thought I'd just highlight a few key recommendations that emerged from this report. So these working groups tend to be a panel of experts, demographers, social scientists, environmental scientists working together. And I've picked out 4 key recommendations. And interestingly, for a population-centric report, one of the first and most important recommendations was you need to bring 1.3 billion people out of poverty. That was sort of a high-level recommendation around the People and Planet report, because what they said is that is absolutely critical to the future of this planet. And of course, what that means is those are going to be people who will be brought out of poverty and will increase their consumption footprint. And that's absolutely part of what's required, because that's coupled with their associated recommendation that you need to reduce inequality. So you're starting to get this interesting discussion about, if this is a shared ecological space, who has access to that? How do we divide that in an unequal world? And that's really the subject of my discipline, political economy, which is where I'm going to sort of be moving towards. I thought the Royal Society report would be a nice segue from the ecological determinism towards the more nuanced political economy. The question about how should that be shared between developed countries, emerging economies, the least developed world, if you want to use that language. And the idea that you need a stabilization of consumption patterns and then a reduction of material consumption. And that's again a high-level recommendation that most developed countries need to start to stabilize consumption patterns and then start to recognize that material consumption levels need to reduce in order to create the space for this 1.3 billion to increase consumption. And in the climate debate, that's been called the contract and converge recommendations, that you sort of, some people have to reduce their consumption in order to allow other people to increase their consumption. And we can come back to this. Clearly, Jonathan Porritt's environmental groups weren't reading this, but one of the Royal Society recommendations was that population and the environment cannot be considered separate issues. You have to think about population and the environment together. So the People and Planet report sort of ends with this question about trying to move away from dependence on material growth as a basis of defining prosperity, and trying to recognize that actually in order to create the space for the global population to continue to prosper, we need to redefine away from the material consumption, the need for particularly emerging economies in the developed world to start to stabilize consumption patterns and then start to reduce material consumption patterns. Now, in some ways that resonates with work which I know Alan is familiar with, which I'm going to refer to now, which is work which takes the threshold idea, but then starts to ask the question about the distributional questions, the political economy challenges of how do you share those ecological resources between the world. This is work by a former colleague of Alan's in Oxfam, Kate Rayworth, who talked about this in the context of what she called critical human deprivations. And the idea is, if you take the Rockstrom natural threshold idea as the sort of outer defining boundary, that the planet can't exceed those thresholds, because that's the critical level beyond which the ecosystem can no longer exist. Can we couple that with what she calls a just space for humanity, a fair space for humanity, in which we take account of what she defines as the critical human deprivations, the access to things like water, food, health, gender equality, social equity. This is the inner ring that I'm reading off here. These issues, which are fundamentally important in terms of defining quality of life for people. So it's not just about the ecological boundaries, but it's about the minimum requirements for humanity to sustain itself in terms of its social space. So you're trying to now combine the social space with the ecological space. And she called this, because of its shape, the donut. So the idea of the donut is kind of really powerful. And what you're looking for is that just that little ring that's within the ecological boundary, but it's above the social threshold. That's the donut idea. And that's, some people have called this the Goldilocks idea. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, right? It's just right, the temperature, so the porridge can be eaten. So you've got to find that just right zone in terms of humanity's operating space. And that's really the sort of critical challenge. She looks at the social goals in relation to the Millennium Development Goals agendas, people trying to look back and see how well we're doing, and finds that actually we're well below the minimum threshold on most of those that she could find some evidence for. So we're not doing too well on any of them, She didn't find too much evidence on in the areas which are blank. But essentially what that says is that we've got to start to find a balance between these debates of ecological limits and the questions that have animated the development and poverty groups for a very long time, which is how do you actually create a just space for humanity, not just a safe ecological space for humanity. And trying to combine them is what the donut idea is. And that, of course, takes us back to much older debates about trying to balance the demands of poverty and the environment. And these sorts of relationships have sometimes been captured in terms of these spirals, that you can be sometimes locked in a downward spiral because the poorer you are, the more you degrade the environment. The more you degrade the environment, the poorer you get. This was something which the 1990 Brundtland report famously talked about. Poverty was seen as both a major cause as well as an effect of global environmental problems. And of course, when the Millennium Development Goals were decided, the fact that in a set of developmental goals, one of the goals was about environmental sustainability showed a high-level recognition that these debates, poverty and environment, were intricately connected to each other. Now, there's a conventional wisdom here, and the conventional wisdom is if you're poor, then you degrade the environment because you have very few choices. And poverty, therefore, is negatively related to sustainable development because poor people don't have long enough time horizons to take account of nature. That's the luxury of the rich. So the kind of relationship that the conventional wisdom suggests flows from poverty causing environmental harm. Poverty is responsible for environmental damage. And that was something that explicitly the World Bank's World Development Report in 1992 talked about when they advocated that the solution was growth. If poverty is the problem, then growth must be the solution. So the World Bank's recommendation in this area 20 years ago was we need economic growth to break the downward spiral. If you're locked in this downward spiral, you can break it by growing your way out of poverty, and that will give you the resources to cope with the environmental challenge. Now, of course, when you're talking about a growth-centric model in terms of ecological limits, that starts to become very challenging. So let's think about some alternative ways in which these relationships have been and might be talked about. What about thinking about it in the context of market failure? What if markets don't allocate resources correctly in terms of pricing? So we don't take account, I was not charged the true cost of my flight because the ecological damage of flying from London to Israel was not really incorporated into the ticket. Market failure. Prices are not reflecting the ecological impacts of my actions. And that's what market failure is really all about, that inevitably people are making choices based on the price signals that they receive, but those price signals don't, at the moment, adequately internalize the environmental costs of the actions that we are undertaking. Tenure policies in many parts of the world encourage people to clear land, to clear forests, and to cultivate on them, because that's the only way in which they can claim ownership over those lands. Now, that's a perverse incentive from the institutional structures that we currently inhabit. We lack effective legal frameworks in many parts of the world. In other places, the legal framework exists, but the administrative capacity to implement the law doesn't exist. So these are a set of failures which are not about growth per se being able to solve, but it's about getting the institutional structures right in order to address some of these issues. So then you have a slightly different kind of relationship, that is policy imperfections that are leading to the lack of the lack of focus on environmental degradation. And actually the policy response isn't grow your way out of these problems, it's focus on the market and institutional failures which are the driving forces. So you're going to get a different set of responses here. What does the political economist say? The political economist asks some much more challenging question, which is, what are the root causes of poverty? Why are people poor? Poverty might be the proximate cause. You might observe a poor person undertaking actions that are supposedly damaging to the environment. But the ultimate reason why they're forced into making those choices is because of global inequality. It's because they are forced into particular types of patterns of behavior because they have very few resources at their command. So really the question which they're talking about here is about the root causes. That's what the political economy question is. That's coupled with the fact that empirically people have done a lot of work demonstrating that the poor can and do care for the environment. So there's a whole host of anthropological studies in communities that are very poor showing their engagement with environmental protection and environmental restoration activities, and we know this, the literature has proliferated in the last 20 to 30 years. So the poor can and do care. They are effective environmental stewards if they're given the opportunities to do so. And we also see the poor as environmental activists. So if you see a lot of the research on environmental social movements, often it's the poor who are in the vanguard of those movements. So the idea that the poor don't care about the environment doesn't seem to be empirically borne out by the evidence. And actually, the fact that sometimes they're forced into particular choices and behaviors that might be damaging to the environment is an outcome of the global inequality that they find themselves trapped in. That suggests that we've got a different problem here. We've got an inequality problem, and the policy prescription is to remove inequality, and it isn't about growing your way out of these problems. Let's think of one last final alternative perspective, which is maybe the causality works in the opposite direction. What do I mean by that? A number of studies which show that if you look at consumption patterns, the poor are the ones who are disproportionately dependent on nature and natural resources for their livelihoods and their subsistence. So if you look at household fuel consumption budgets, the poor will be spending more of their resources on fuel inputs. The poor are the ones who will be more dependent on things like access to the commons, access to water, through gathering resources rather than buying them through market-mediated relationships. So a number of studies from household level which are actually showing that in a village setting, in a rural setting, that there's a disproportionate dependence of those on the lowest ends of the income spectrum on natural resources for livelihoods and subsistence compared to those who are richer, who can afford to buy alternatives, cooking gas, kerosene rather than wood fuel. And then to complete that relationship, the impact of external pressures which are damaging the environment is that it's actually undermining the resource base on which the poor depend. So the poor are suffering the consequences of environmental degradation, they're not causing it. That's why I say this is reversing the causality. Environmental degradation is causing poverty. It's not poverty that's causing environmental degradation. And environmental degradation is being driven by factors outside of the control of the poor. It's being driven by external factors which are not their fault. So actually that's the reverse causality from where we started. And then of course, that raises a really interesting possibility, and this is where I start to sort of think in slightly more optimistic terms, which is that maybe our efforts to restore the environment aren't just about restoring the environment for its own sake, but are actually one of our most powerful anti-poverty measures. Because by restoring the environment, you're disproportionately impacting the poor who depend on that environment for their livelihoods. So you're actually improving poor people's lives by restoring the environment. So actually environmental sustainability starts to become a poverty alleviation strategy. And this is where the sort of convergence comes and offers some interesting options. So what the political economy says here is sort of captured in two quotes which I've borrowed from my colleague Tim Bayless-Smith, who's been lecturing on these issues for some time at the University of Cambridge. And he resurrected the work of the 19th century scholar William Cobbett. A really, really interesting quote about the distributional questions, and almost sort of the father of political ecology, you could call him. And he says, that our indignation and rage against this infernal system is not half roused. He's talking about agricultural labourers who raise all the food and drink in England in the 19th century, but consume just a trifling portion of it. And that's the inequality, that the production base of the economy has very little access to the consumption. The consumption patterns are dominated by the behaviors of a small fraction of the population, whereas the toiling labourer is producing all of this food in the 19th century. Coming forward to the sort of 21st century that we inhabit, David Satterthwaite, who's done a lot of work on urban issues and climate issues in the journal Environment and Urbanization, talking about carbon emissions here. The real issue is the inappropriateness of allocating responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions to nations, and by that implication to the entire nation's population. Human-induced greenhouse gas emissions are not caused by people in general, but by specific human activities, by specific people or groups of people. And for the political economist, the question is, who are those groups of people, and how do we attribute responsibility in these sorts of contexts? It's not an aggregate problem, and this is where I'm sort of taking issue with the boundaries and thresholds kind of thinking. it aggregates the problem across the whole globe, but doesn't recognize the distributional questions which a political economist would like to think about. And that's where political economy comes in. It's not a problem that we're running out of global space. We have to ask the question about how are we running out of global space? Who is pushing us towards these patterns of behavior? So I'm going to illustrate this with issues around water and water stress, which I think would be nice and familiar. And these are just sort of quick maps, but they kind of illustrate the issue pretty well, and carbon, and then conclude with some thoughts about political economy. So this is a map from the Royal Society report that I referred to earlier. Current global water stresses, so very quickly, the areas which are red are water stressed. The areas which are not red have low water stress at the present moment. And then they look at the future. So this is their projections for the future. And what you're seeing is that you're getting an increasing amount of water stress around the world. Okay? So this is the kind of classic ecological representation of the world. You've got a sort of global problem. At best, you'll get it disaggregated at country level. This is the sort of political economy question. And this is in the Royal Society report. So they are actually starting to think about this in very interesting ways. And they talk about municipal water withdrawal. And this is a sort of box plot. So it kind of shows you the variation in people's consumption behavior. But it also tells you where the sort of average lies. And it's telling you about municipal water use across different income groups. And you've got the rich countries, the high OECD countries at one end. You've got the low-income countries at the other end. One thing that you can see is that the average consumption of water in cities, it starts to tail off. But obviously, the average consumption in poorer countries is a lot less than the average consumption in richer countries. It's interesting that you're getting this kind of pattern where maybe the worst offenders lie in this sort of the countries which haven't quite reached the highest levels of material prosperity. So actually there's something going on in the sort of high middle income, or just the countries which are in transition, where they're actually consuming a lot more per capita than the countries which have perhaps been industrialized for several years. But more interestingly for me, this figure showed the variation. So you've got this kind of average in the middle, so the big box in the middle. But look at the variation, and look at in the low middle income countries, the variation. I mean, the richest consumers in low middle income countries are consuming at the level of the richest consumers in the highest income countries, whereas their compatriots are right down at the bottom. And that's the distributional question. So this same figure allows us to think about this distributional question in really interesting ways. Look at the extremes of those plots. Look at how far up particularly that one goes. People in those lower middle income countries, some of them are leading lifestyles that are no different to the most affluent people in the world. So breaking those figures down at country level sometimes fails to take account of within country variation. So I'm going to illustrate that with carbon again. And I'll use an example based on some Greenpeace work done in India. So bring it back home to where I sort of started a lot of my work in order to sort of illustrate this point before broadening out to a few conclusions. So again, the Royal Society report looked at carbon emissions around the world, broke it down by green, the least developed countries. And you can see that, from the 1980s to 2010, it's a slight increase, but not a huge amount. The less developed countries, look at that over that 30-year period. And the more developed countries is kind of leveling off. And in fact, some suggestion, maybe that's the 2008 recession, some suggestion that it's actually dropping, at least in 2008, 9, 10. And the less developed countries have caught up with the carbon emissions of the more developed world. Interesting. Let's look at that in a different way. That was aggregates. Let's shift that to per capita. And this is the way in which these debates around climate justice in the international forums are often constructed. What about per capita emissions? And per capita emissions tells a very different story. The per capita emissions of the more developed countries are considerably higher than those of that's the world average. The next one, the gray one, the less developed countries still in red. And even though those are going up, they're nowhere near catching up with global averages. And the least developed countries are still very, very low. So the per capita discussion says, if each human being on the earth has an equal right to pollute, then we should really be looking at this figure. And then to attribute the future carbon problem to the rapidly emerging developing economies is a misattribution. Actually, per capita, it continues to be a problem of the affluent developed world. Look at that big difference between the per capita consumption levels. Okay, and that has been part of the international debate around consumption and consumption patterns. And it's been captured very powerfully by the Indian government. The Indian government, in its various international positions, has made this point. Just a few quotes from their public statements on this. India contributes only 4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, and in terms of per capita emissions, it's about 23%, well below the global average. It's about a quarter of the total global average. Therefore, it has been our stand, the government of India's stand, so far not to agree to any commitments related to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by India. India has a considerable place to go to catch up with world averages. That's their argument. And a public commitment in negotiations, India will not allow its per capita greenhouse gas emissions to exceed the average per capita emissions of the developed countries. So, and this is international diplomacy. You smile, and of course, this is what international diplomats do. So this is an interesting negotiating point. They're using the per capita argument to their advantage in the international negotiation. So I was really interested in this, and Greenpeace India did a really interesting report leading up to one of the big climate summits. And they called it Hiding Behind the Poor. And this report starts to break down the question of emissions by different income classes within a country. And let's see what the evidence tells us about that. Here's the evidence on different income classes. This is monthly income in rupees. So this is the poorest, that's the richest. And you can immediately see that the carbon emissions of the richest Indians are almost 4 times that of the poorest Indians. Okay? And that's what the Greenpeace report highlights. And what it's saying is that when we talk about the question of climate injustice, there is climate injustice globally between countries. There is also climate injustice within countries because of the inequality of consumption patterns within countries. The pollution of India's wealthiest classes is 4.5 times that of its poorest. That's almost as big as the difference between average India per capita and average Europe per capita. So when India talks about per capita and uses it to its advantage, it's hiding within it the fact that some of its consumption classes are actually consuming at European levels. And you can see this. India's richest up there are catching up with world average. So when India makes a public commitment that we will never exceed global average per capita consumption, it's probably time to start limiting the consumption patterns of its richest people, because they are starting to exceed global averages. And that starts to ask this question of justice and injustice in very different terms. So it takes me back to the justice question that Kate Raworth posed. When we talk about just operating space for humanity in the context of ecological thresholds, these sorts of distributional questions need to be taken very seriously. Just as a final sort of aside on the climate discussion, sometimes you get some perverse outcomes, and biofuels, I think, helps me illustrate this possibly the best. People realized that fossil fuels were no longer a sustainable way to power our energy-based economy. They realized that nature, biology, biological processes can provide alternative sources of fuel, biofuels, jatropha, source of diesel, corn-based oil, ethanol, various other sources. And across the world, various governments decided to make a commitment to a minimum biofuel mix within their transport fleets. The World Watch Institute did a study and found that if the US were to use only its own domestic resources to meet its 10% biofuel target, 30% of its agricultural land would have to be devoted just to producing energy. The EU would need, because of lower productivity levels, 72% of its land only to produce energy. So where does the food come from? And that's the question. The corn required to fill one SUV with bioethanol could feed a person for a year. So what are you trying to then make choices about here? In order to meet the energy consumption demands of the affluent, you're forcing people to eat less. That's a terrible trade-off to be making. And that's a trade-off which was sort of motivated by a well-meaning desire to reduce global carbon emissions, to move our dependence away from fossil fuels. So sometimes these technological solutions can have unintended consequences. you're being forced to choose between, in this case, 800 million people across the world who own automobiles and 3 billion people who live on less than $2 a day. What kind of a choice is this? And George Monbiot, another columnist in the UK, has called it an agricultural crime against humanity. So let's pull back and ask a few questions around what political economy, in my title, allows us to do in these contexts. I think the basic argument is quite simple, that environmental change is rarely going to be about winners unambiguously or losers unambiguously. There are winners and losers. There are distributional consequences when environmental change happens. Many changes that people have often talked about as improvements, for instance, the creation of protected areas to protect wildlife, have involved the displacement of people from formerly accessible common areas. So there is a trade-off here. In order to create fenced-off national parks, often people have been displaced from those same areas. There's a social consequence, there's a negative social consequence. It's not win-win, there's win and lose. And we have to make choices about the winners and losers. That's one type of dilemma, that you have some people gaining and other people losing. What about when you actually create a net new resource? You increase, through technological interventions, the availability of drinking water. This is where the distributional question starts to become important. Who gets access to it? The difference between the amount of water that a slum dweller in Delhi consumes and somebody living in an affluent middle class neighborhood. When you create new drinking water supplies, is the water going to go to the slum dweller, or is it going to go to the increased consumption of the affluent middle class? Are we going to be creating new golf courses on the outskirts of Delhi, which we are, or are we going to be using this water to supply the critical water needs of the poorest populations of that city? And those paradoxes of inequality, of course, are apparent everywhere around us. I'm sure are familiar to you as well. So when resources do increase in aggregate, if we do this technological bit, who gets access to those resources remains a political economy question. What is the distributional consequence? So the costs and benefits associated with these environmental changes are not equally distributed amongst actors, and political economy gives us the tools to ask that question. Who gains, who loses? We need to look at those hidden losers, sometimes not obvious in these debates, which are about aggregates. When we look at the aggregates, we fail to look at the complexity of winners and losers. And we particularly care about some who are affected because they are often the most vulnerable, often the poorest members of society, often a lot of evidence suggesting that women depend disproportionately upon these natural processes. So the gender dimensions of those victims is very important as well. So people who are deserving of a special focus in terms of our attention. Let me go back, because I started with him. One of my authors was Danny Dorling. A good quote from his book: the actual number of people on the planet is to an important extent incidental to the impact humans have on both the environment and each other. So he's sort of saying it doesn't matter whether it's 9 billion or 10 billion. It's not how many of us there are, but how we live that will matter most. And we need to acknowledge, just to conclude, this reality of choice between rich and poor, both across nations and within nations, between terms that people have used in this context, greed and need. But who gets to define what's greed and what's need? Let's ask ourselves that question. Between the present and the future, what does posterity mean? And I know these are issues that Avner has thought about a lot. And I think that political economy, or what people are now increasingly calling political ecology, offers us an approach which at least allows us to ask these questions and to start to think about reconciling some of these competing claims, rather than what perhaps a focus on boundaries, thresholds, and limits does, which is a technocentric focus on just finding an efficient solution to a global aggregated problem without asking these much tougher distributional questions. Thank you.
Questions?
So, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. It's about this corn. I mean, one of the last points, corn and biofuel. I mean, it's always presented like this, right? I mean, we were very happy that we had this new technology, but then we were all disappointed because we realized that the alternative, I mean, we lost the alternative, which was to feed people. Well, why is it presented that way? I mean, we use land for many other, products, so to speak. So we use land to feed cows so we can eat meat. But if we all become vegetarians, we can save a lot of land, and on this land we can grow corn for biofuel. I mean, isn't it a matter of rhetoric? I mean, how we present it? And
Yeah.
I mean, didn't we give up this option too hastily?
Yeah, I think, Avner, you're raising a really important point, because I think it is about what was given up in order to generate this new form of energy. In some parts of the world, the debate was very much about, could we grow energy crops on lands that were not productively being used at the moment? So the simplest solution would be if you had completely degraded land that was not actually productive, was not being used by any human population, even by grazers for their cattle or for their goats and so on. And actually there was sort of a very low, to use my kind of training, opportunity cost to that land. There were no alternatives that you were foregoing in order to create this new energy crop. But what you're asking is really, what is the opportunity cost of creating this new energy crop? Now, the reaction was because in some places, productive agricultural lands were converted over, for good reason, to energy crop, because suddenly the farmer is getting a lot more money because they're selling into the energy market rather than selling into the food market. They're responding rationally, as any farmer would, to the price signal. The price signal says, look, you're going to get more money for corn for energy than corn for food. So they will convert their productive land over precisely to the energy market. Now that's the connection across the landscape that sometimes isn't being made. So I do agree with you. I think we might be abandoning some of these potential interventions too easily without thinking about that larger landscape within which these interventions are being made. What is the opportunity cost? What are the alternative uses of that land? If we are, let's say, converting to a different form of agricultural production and we're sparing some land, we're creating some new excess land that's not needed for food production, could that be devoted to some of this energy production? But of course, then there are going to be other competing claims on that. Urbanization, industry. So the question of land is absolutely at the heart of some of these debates. They haven't been cast in those terms. So I think we need to recast that bioenergy debate in terms of what are the alternative uses of land, what are the most productive uses of that land, both from a sort of societal perspective as well as what current economic signals tell us. The problem with that bioenergy debate was that economic signals very quickly went to farmer getting more money for corn ethanol than getting money for corn chicken feed. So the farmer then went down the corn ethanol route. And then, that's what that debate was. But I think you're right to raise the question. I think we can go back to that in a more nuanced way.
Going on from here, I think that there's two questions that arise. One is when you talked about the boundaries, so you presented, the boundaries, for example, the ecological footprint. But once you go to look what's under this ecological footprint, then you see that it stands on extremely shaky foundation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most of it is actually greenhouse gas emissions, and the forest area needed to capture the greenhouse gas emissions,
yep,
which is about 90% of the footprint.
Yep.
Everything else is trivial.
Yep.
And that is, and then you ask, is that really the main issue,
Mm-hmm.
which determines some sort of boundary? So, and then we start from that boundary to,
Mm-hmm.
to use ethanol and turn corn and whatever, because of this standing on very flimsy foundations.
Mm.
And the other side of it is that we treat corn as corn, and corn is not one thing. I mean, corn for fuel is one thing, corn for food, let's say, to this population is another thing, and
Mm-hmm.
corn for as a basic need is the third thing.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true for water.
Mm-hmm.
Water is not H2O,
Yeah.
we talk socially.
Yeah.
There's different, water which you use for drinking is a different thing
Mm-hmm.
than water which you use in a jacuzzi. So there's
Yeah.
this type of thing that we're talking about, water or corn as a singular issue, which is all in the market and it's all the question of opportunity cost, is part of the problem because
Yeah.
we're structuring it actually going around this, the real
Yeah.
thing which we were talking about, which
Yeah.
is the difference between needs and where the economic market ends and where the economic market begins.
Thank you for that comment. I mean, I think I agree with what you're saying because essentially it's moving away from those either aggregations, which is what the footprint kind of thing does, or talking about these issues outside of their social context, disembedding the resource from the social context in which it's consumed, produced, accessed. Interestingly, in some countries, South Africa, I know, in its water law, talks specifically about the different types of water and prioritizes different types of water. So actually, water for industry and recreation is the lowest priority legally. Now, there's interesting questions about enforcement and how that happens, but defining the ecological reserve, the social need for water as priorities is at least a step in the right direction, saying that this resource, H2O, actually has different social purposes. And we need to recognize and make choices, make priorities between these different competing needs. So if you're consuming in order to water your lawn or to have a lovely golf course, your ability to access that water, either through the price signal or in terms of the priority, you're the last person in the queue when water is being rationed. Those sorts of prioritization exercises don't happen because, essentially water gets distributed to whoever is willing to pay for it at a single price. And that doesn't reflect the priorities, the social priorities of those sorts of resources. So I think that's exactly the sort of point that I'm making, that when we get caught up by boundary, threshold, limit type thinking, we lose the social context. Alan, you had yours first, and then we'll go around the room.
I think what you said before, just now, I mean, the poor actually pay a lot more for water
Yeah.
than the rich.
Yeah,
So that,
because they're not prioritized in municipal systems. So they're often not paying. They're paying more because they're excluded from public provision. Yeah, yeah.
so they might pay 5 times. Or
Yeah,
10 times.
because they rely on informal systems which are much more expensive.
The other thing I wanted to pick up a little bit on the land issue because there is an argument about energy return on energy invested, and that suggests that all these attempts to compensate for the depletion of fossil fuels are bound to fail because fossil fuels were generated over millions of years. And there's a kind of basic energy equation which we can never get away from, whether it's algae or corn or any of these things. I think well, I mean, as far as corn is concerned, the point is that you have to spend a lot of energy to grow the corn.
Yeah.
And I think it's, there's a lot of argument
Yeah.
about the return, but it's very low
Yeah.
compared with
Yeah.
fossil fuels. So
Yeah.
I think land is an intermediate issue.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway.
No, I think the energy economy and how we move away from our conventional uses of energy towards different forms is really one of the 21st century questions. Now, I think we've experimented with land-based alternatives like bioenergy. It's very interesting in the UK that the nuclear issue has re-entered into debate. If you look across at 2 countries immediately in the neighborhood, France and Germany have very different public discourses around nuclear energy. So, where do you stand on nuclear energy? There's questions around long-term hazard. There are questions around contribution to global warming. And you would end up with quite different conclusions. Hydro-based energy, again, another renewable source. Again, a very controversial issue. Big dams have been famously associated with some of the worst negative social impacts. Parts of the world that you'll be traveling to in Ethiopia sort of very famously associated with that. So I think that energy dilemma is right squarely at the heart of us thinking about this shift, this dramatic cultural shift that's needed. What kinds of energy sources should we be using? How should we access? I think about some interesting alternatives. So there's a really interesting organization working in rural Rajasthan which is training women to manage solar panels at village level. And there's a really interesting film about their work online called Solar Warriors. And they're basically doing this. Firstly, they're educating the women to do it for a very good reason, because the women, once they're trained, will not leave the village. What the founder says is, you train a young man, he'll immediately migrate to the city to look for a job in solar engineering. Whereas the women of the village will stay and carry on managing the resource at village level. But the video is fascinating because there are these rural Rajasthani women who don't speak any English, don't speak any language other than their own native language, training women from parts of Africa who speak no common language, just by demonstration, by color coding, and this idea of off-grid solar in places which get sunlight is really interesting. Now, the problem again, sometimes the solar debate gets dominated by people who want to build massive solar grids and massive distribution networks. Evidence from India suggests 40% of energy loss is in the distribution network. So why not generate the energy at village level and consume it at village level? Why put it into a grid where you know inefficiencies of distribution will mean that you're going to lose a lot of that energy? Capture it and use it locally. In a state like Rajasthan, which gets lots of sunshine, use it at village level. You don't have to export to a grid. That's the kind of engineering solution which people are not taking seriously enough at the moment, I feel. And in countries that have that resource, at least for the next many thousand years, let's use the sun as best as we can, but not get trapped into the engineering thinking of big grid-based distribution networks. Those are inefficient. There were some hands on this side. Let me start sweeping from the left, so let's go with you.
So, first of all, thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting. I'm a global student. I just came back from Ethiopia, and I had a project regarding biofuel, to use organic waste to do briquettes. And I think that one of the hardest things to do, it's not that we have an amazing product yet, but that it's hard to make population create this social change, and this is only with using like better products. Moreover, to make people consume less, I think in our countries where consumption is the culture. You can see it, when you feel it. You didn't talk about the context of the place you were in, but you can see that one of the major forces, one might say, that Israel faces in order to change its social behavior is economic one. I mean, some people say that, I mean, people will give up Jerusalem if you will take their iPhone away. But it kind of leads me to the question of, like, what do you think is the next step? I mean, this is like a room full of scholars or students or whatever who think about sustainability as something that is important. But like the average person in the street, what will be your call for action for him? What, maybe in our context, maybe the development that we are trying and doing in developing countries, maybe we need to use that force in order to do it here in the developed countries. I mean, talk about consumption, doing things like that, and maybe it will be more efficient. So I just kind of wonder what you from.
So I think it's a really interesting question. I was anticipating that somebody might ask me whether I was a pessimist or an optimist, and that question hasn't been asked yet, but I'll answer it in those terms, which is, of what am I optimistic and of what am I pessimistic? And I don't know, maybe it's still a fond hope, but I do believe that humans react empathetically to the plight of fellow human beings. And I think that's what we possibly need to emphasize in these discussions. So by bringing the distributional question, the political economy question, center stage, by saying that the impacts of our choices are hurting people around us because we are consuming the resource that other people don't have access to. I feel more optimistic about that in terms of the ecological message. So the question is, how do you message these issues, right? We've known about this for a very long time. The debates that I'm talking about here are not new. but somehow the way they've been packaged hasn't got through, and people continue. This is not an exception. The patterns of consumption that you're defining here are the defining patterns of consumption in most parts of the world. Now the question is, when you're making those choices, do you think about the consequences on others around you? And should we be asking people to think more about that rather than some distant environmental harm that is going to happen to other people you don't know in a future that you won't inhabit? Clearly that message hasn't worked. The idea that we should be other regarding in terms of future generations which are not yet born in a different part of the world, I suspect I'm more pessimistic about that as the message. I think if we can turn that message around to a present day concern about people around you and force people to think about the consequences, they may start to take that more seriously. When you're confronted with the inequality that your consumption patterns are contributing to, you might react more favorably. So that's what I would be optimistic. Maybe I'm foolish, but that's, I feel, a more reasonable message than the message about the future, which I think people just don't get.
Maybe just like taxes.
Yeah, and that's the redistribution. Well, exactly.
Take care of other people in this country.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the slides I was toying with putting in, there's some really interesting recent data on the income share of the top 1%, and how over the last 20 to 30 years it's continuing to climb, despite recession, despite all the, and again an Oxfam piece of work actually in the UK most recently, and it's staggering. And actually, you know, there's some interesting psychological evidence which says that in terms of life satisfaction, it starts to taper off once you start earning about $60,000 a year. So anyone who's earning more than $60,000 a year, the sort of incremental increase in their well-being because they're earning 5 times that amount is actually very little. So the taxation solution would be, once you hit that threshold of happiness, whatever it might be, start taking away, you know, because the extra $10,000 is not going to make that much difference to your life, but you give it to somebody very poor, it'll make a huge difference to their life. That's what taxation used to do. That's the good old welfare state.
Can we take one last question?
Sorry, you've been waiting. Yeah, why?
Okay, actually, my question was that I want to just go a little bit further. I don't see people that have this amount of money paying this amount of taxes because they do have this amount of money. They are the banks, they are the people who are asking for the taxes. So this is a little bit difficult to happen. But what I was thinking when we were talking about the corn and the space and how we're going to manage the water and everything, I kept thinking, like you just said, that the problem is not in the developing countries, it's in the countries that are already there.
Mm-hmm.
They are producing like in a crazy scale.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking like the water is being drained by big corporations to
Mm-hmm.
produce 1 kilo of iron.
Mm-hmm.
You spend enormous quantity of water
Mm-hmm.
to produce cotton. It's amazing how much water you will
Mm-hmm.
spend. And you cannot control the people in that level of taxes, and
Mm-hmm.
you cannot completely control people on culture level. But could you actually affect the industry? And how would you control that in the consumption factor? Should you create NGOs that will start working with the companies and will diminish the products, the availability? How can we change this kind of situation? Not in a just because if you are very rich and you are in the developed country and you don't have contact because you are in such high state life, and you don't have this contact with the other person being so poor, and you have this kind of feeling.
I think firstly I wouldn't give up on making them experience that and make them have contact. I don't think they should be allowed to isolate themselves from the social world in which they live. So you're right, at the moment a lot of people lead these insulated lives, sort of roll up their air conditioner windows and, you know, make sure that they don't encounter life around them. I would continue to try and make them realize that there is another world around them, and I think those connections need to be made. But your secondary point, which is an interesting one, which is actually a lot of global production is controlled by corporations. A lot of global production is in the hands of other forms of resource control. And how do we try and get them to take some of these issues seriously? Now again, governments are important because corporations respond to regulation. And if you're being allowed to consume water because your factory doesn't have to pay for water, then there's a deep problem. There was a sort of classic case of a Coca-Cola plant in southern India, which actually was taken to court by the panchayat, the local council, saying that you're consuming more than the average of what people in this area consume, and the court upheld that order. So that sort of action is really important, trying to make corporations take account and act as global citizens. They cannot extract these resources disproportionately. Now, and the role of government, I think, is central there, because they do respond to regulation. What they want is, I talk to some companies and they say we want even regulation, so that there's not these kind of patches of uneven regulation. So actually they are saying we'd like governments to regulate as long as all governments regulate in the same way. And I think there is some scope there. And we should be making our governments, our elected representatives, respond to that, because that's our power. If we make the elected representatives respond and tax corporations, that's where there is a future. Okay.
Thank you very much on that.